I'm Cindy Briggs, and this is Soldier's Heart. This is a story about friendship as much as it is a story about war. I met World War II veteran Everett Smith through his daughter Tricia. I met Tricia through a mutual friend. She wanted help capturing her father's story now that he was in his 90s. But there was a problem. He didn't particularly care to tell it. Tricia and I met for coffee at a place downtown, and one of the first things she said to me was, "He's not going to want to talk to you." My heart sank. This was summer of 2014, just a few months after I'd begun this oral history project. I'd interviewed just a few veterans at that point, all eager to talk to me, pleased that someone cared to listen. Tricia explained that Everett was a good man, a generous one. He dedicated his life to helping others as a country doctor near Asheville. But being social wasn't of interest to him. Tricia recalled how when her gregarious mother threw parties, Everett could be found in his study, quietly reading a book. Sharing his war stories with a perfect stranger was not an idea that appealed to him. I was about to demur to explain to Tricia that I didn't want to coerce anyone into sharing their story. But then her eyes reddened and her voice broke, and she explained how she didn't want to lose those stories when he died. I thought of my own grandfather, a World War II veteran himself, who died with his stories inside of him. I would give almost anything to hear his voice now, to hear how it was then. So of course, when Tricia asked, I said yes. On July 29, 2014, I showed up at their home with my recorder and a generous helping of nerves. Tricia met me at the door, smiling, excited. Everett hovered in the background, a thin man with wispy white hair, wearing a cardigan sweater and pressed blue jeans. He looked like a teenager dragged to a doctor's appointment. As we settled into his study and I set up my recorder, I figured I'd be out of there in an hour, 90 minutes tops. I'd do my best, but my hopes weren't high. I felt prematurely bad for letting Tricia down. Everett started by showing me his collection of Nazi souvenirs. By the way, American GIs are notorious for souvenir hunting. Somehow Everett managed to bring home a bunch of weapons, pins, and medals. He showed me the paperwork from his service and explained he'd been a medic in the 30th Infantry Division. He was matter-of-fact in his storytelling. No show, no flash. It seemed clear that being a veteran wasn't a big part of his identity, and he wasn't quite sure why anyone would care to hear about it. Once our show and tell was over, he sat down at his desk and for the first time appeared unsure of what to say next. I suggested we begin at the beginning. So do you want to start back at the beginning about...
Probably that'd be the best way.
So tell me about how you got into the Army. Did you enlist? Were you drafted? And were you excited about it?
No, everybody was... I could have volunteered, of course, but I just let them draft me, and... that was when I was in, I was going to school at Broadview Academy, right outside of Chicago.
What was the mood during basic training? How did people feel about going over to the war?
Well, they pretty well accepted that they were going and wondering where, you didn't know where you were going, but we're pretty optimistic.
After basic training at Camp Grant, Illinois, Everett chose to train as a medic because of his pacifist religious beliefs as a Seventh-day Adventist. If he had to go to war, he wanted to help rather than to harm. He then journeyed across the United States to New York, and then across the ocean to England, where his training continued. In early June 1944, he and the other soldiers knew there was a big offensive coming, but they didn't know where or when. On June 6th, Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, D-Day. Then on June 22nd, just 2 weeks after the Normandy landings, Everett arrived on Omaha Beach.
So they sent us, we were still not assigned to anybody, so they put us in another little tent camp in the woods up above Omaha Beach. I know that everybody was curious to look around and see what was around, see if there was any evidence of the battle. Well, there was a German soldier that was dead up there,
Wow.
in uniform and all, but nobody ever found him, so everybody had to go up there and look at the first German soldier they saw.
Wow.
And we spent several days there. I was there till the 13th of July in that little camp.
Everett was finally assigned to a unit, the 30th Infantry Division, 119th Regiment, 3rd Battalion. He was their medic, their aid man, who had come to be known as Doc. Medics were extraordinary heroes. They came under fire just as the infantry did, but carried no weapon. Armed only with bandages, morphine, and sulfur powder, they ran into shelling, mortar attacks, and machine gun fire to save their fellow men. Everett remembered his first experience in combat.
Going back to where the 3rd Battalion was, we had to drive for several miles. But going over there was sort of scary because we were going along a little dirt road sort of, and Germans apparently had observation there, and they kept shelling, trying to hit us in the Jeep. And Fry just kept driving as fast as he could, you know. They wouldn't be any safer standing still if they see you there. Mm-hmm. It didn't hit. Sometimes it would be a explosion right ahead of us, and then sometimes the next one would be behind us. But we didn't get hit, and but when we got to where they were dug in and along a hedgerow. Do you know what a hedgerow is? Mm-hmm. They were sort of dug along a hedgerow. First time I'd ever heard a shell land and then exploded, and then the shrapnel was shooting out. It just sounded like a bee buzzing or something. The first time I'd heard of that.
His first experiences as a medic were no less harrowing.
I had right 2 in a row, 2 soldiers stepped on charges that the Germans had put into and blew their legs off about here. I went down there to try to stop the bleeding on this first one, and I gave him morphine, and you know, it was just hanging by the skin, the foot and leg, and it was hard to stop the bleeding and everything with this thing in the way. And I told the fellow I thought it'd be best to take the foot off, and then I could treat it better to stop the bleeding. And he didn't much want to, but I think he finally accepted it, so I stopped it. And right away, I don't remember if it happened while I was there or just before. There was another boy watching on the head that stepped on another landmine and blew his foot off like that. And I was busy with this other one. By the time I got to him, he said, "Doc," he said, "I cut it off myself. I knew you'd want it off."
I want to pause here to remind you that Everett was 19 years old at this point. 19. I don't know what you were doing at age 19, but I sure as hell wasn't making decisions about whether or not to cut off a man's foot. Everett and the rest of the 30th Infantry Division endured heavy combat all through France. But by August, the tide of the war seemed to be turning in the Allies' favor.
So after that, the Germans really were in flight, and as far as it was very little standing still. They had lost so many tanks, so many troops. They were just trying to get out of there, and they were going through France, getting away. And I remember following them. Times or two I've seen just on the field, just huge formations of German soldiers marching back to surrender. No Americans with them really.
Wow.
They really gave a lot. And so we went we got up west of Paris. All the French were so happy to be released from their from the Germans, and
so you felt a real warm reception from them. They were excited to see you.
And that was the best part of the war, I think, is from the time we got away from Mortain and got through to Belgium and Holland. Those were just wonderful times, because even those fighting, sporadic fighting, the people came out. They'd bring wine bottles for us, even though they'd had them hidden from the Germans all these years. The women got up in the back of the trucks with us and kissing and hugging us all, and it was just, just a good feeling.
Unfortunately, the good times didn't last. By the time the 30th Infantry reached Belgium and the Netherlands, the first American troops to enter both countries, the Germans had begun their final offensive push leading up to the Battle of the Bulge.
Another little town wasn't too far away, and one morning, all these people coming down this little old footpath or road from this other town. Old people, children, women, old women, young too, but they were escaping this town where the fighting was going on there. But it was sort of pitiful to see people pushing their belongings in a baby buggy or a little hand wagon or something, and it's just, it's hard to realize how living there, your home and all, the home's destroyed, you're left with nothing, and you don't even have a place to sleep or a place to get food or anything. It's just not a good deal.
Mm-mm. By mid-December 1944, the 30th Infantry Division entered Stoumont, Belgium, and into a hornet's nest of German activity.
When we got to Stoumont, it's getting dark. We could hear the German tanks coming up from the other way. And then in the morning, just shortly after daybreak, here we could see the tanks coming. And we had no tanks. But anyway, the tanks were coming, and around the tanks you see the German soldiers coming. And again, I was sort of in the rear of they told us then that we better backtrack, because we didn't have after fighting so much, we didn't have any air cover or anything, and we just couldn't stop the Germans. We were falling back, and again I was in the back of the unit, and we ran into and got through a window of one house. The Germans were visible, coming close with their tanks, and the machine guns started firing at us up there, but we got in the house. Well, a German tank came and parked in front of the door, open door. So we couldn't, the machine gun on one side firing at us and the tank there. So the houses over there oftentimes have the barn attached to the house. Well, this house had a house, a barn, and then steps going down the basement. And we chose the basement and thought we'd just hide there, hopefully that they wouldn't find us. And down in the basement was some big bins of potatoes and stuff like that. There was 3 of us in the house when this happened, and me and 2 others. We got in these bins of potatoes, and Germans didn't come in didn't come down the basement and look. But all night long there was a German up above. We hear him walking around. There's a guard standing there watching the street and all that. One morning, German soldiers started coming down the steps. It was dark as pitch dark down there was no lights. They had their machine pistols here coming down the steps. They didn't know we were there. But one of the guys with us, after a while, they got halfway down the steps, he said, "American comrades down here." And the Germans just didn't have any idea we were there, so they ran back up the steps and yelled for us to come out, and we did. Anyway, during the day, then around noon, I guess it was, they took me and some other American prisoners and took us down, and put us on half track because of snow and all. And we came upon this beautiful big chateau. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? And in the chateau, German headquarters of the spearhead that took us. In the lower level, in the more or less basement level of this place, they had it full of German wounded, and there was a doctor, MD, German doctor, and there were American prisoner wounded, and put me to work taking care of the wounded. They had a lot of wounded there. They had one tank crew, a German tank crew, that their tank had been set on fire, and before they got out, they had almost 90% wounds, I guess, coverage of their body. And they already had them all bandaged up with burn dressings, all face, head, whole body. Winter, when we were there during the war, there was one big room that opened to the outside, and that room was piled high with dead bodies. They're frozen stiff. They couldn't bury them. But after a week or so, Colonel Piper came in.
Let's pause here for just a moment to talk about Colonel Piper. Joachim Piper was an SS field officer and adjutant to Himmler himself. Himmler was one of the most powerful men in the Nazi Party and the architect of the Holocaust. Piper was Himmler's man in the field, a celebrated war hero in Germany, and absolutely brutal in his retaliation against those who dared to defy the Nazis. The Malmedy Massacre was one such instance. On December 17, 1944, American POWs were lined up in a snowy field and machine-gunned to the ground. 84 died and were left frozen in that field as a warning to other Allied troops. Everett was in nearby Stewmont during the massacre, which happened just days before he was taken prisoner. Now, back to his story.
Piper came in, and he and the doctor, the German doctor, came in and got the other medic and me, took us in a little room, and he said, we've run out of gas for the tanks, and we're having to retreat. He said, everybody that goes will have to walk. He said, we're taking all the Germans that can walk, the wounded that can walk are coming with us, but we're leaving all the American wounded here, and we're leaving the German wounded that can't leave, and we're leaving them in your care. And he said, we're leaving one non-commissioned officer, German officer, here to look after things. He'll be here with you, and he's going to be checking on you. Well, one day, we saw some Americans running by, and there were paratroopers who had dropped in behind the Germans. They took me and the other medic with them back to Stumont, and guess what? It was Christmas Eve. We were really happy. We had some Christmas presents that gotten home from home, and all that, and had a real Christmas after all that.
After the collapse of the German offensive, Allied troops rushed into Germany towards Berlin. The Nazi Party was on the verge of collapse. Their military was quickly running out of resources and troops. Instead of massive, well-organized military campaigns, the war devolved into man-to-man street fighting. Everett experienced it firsthand.
There was a town in 2 miles in there, a little village we were going to capture, or supposedly. We all hated that, but anyway, he says it's going to be real dark, there'll be no smoking, there'll be no lights of any kind. He said, we'll go in 2 columns, and he said, you'll have your hand on the shoulder of the man ahead of you. It's so dark you don't want to lose contact. We got there, we got to the middle of town quietly, and then the Germans discovered we were there. And they started shelling and fighting. By then the German tanks were really coming into town, and we couldn't do a thing about it, but we ended up in a big house setting a little back from the street that ended up with 50 of us in there. Germans had completely reoccupied the whole town. It's okay if I read some of it. We rushed into the nearest house where we found Captain Lee, that's our company commander, and a group of men. I heard the voice of Lieutenant Miller coming over the walkie-talkie. German tanks, he said, have broken through my position. I cannot stop them. At that very moment, we could hear the roaring and grinding of the tanks along the street. We were completely cut off. One thing I did, medics did not carry, and we're not supposed to carry arms. I had a little German pistol I had in my pocket, but I dug a hole in the basement where we were and buried it, because if they found me with that, I'd be in bad shape. The Germans would send troops in. They knew by this time that we were there. Sent troops in to try to capture this house and where we were in. And along about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this Colonel Weber said, we've got everybody out but your company. You're going to have to be on your own, and we can't help you. and it said we're running out of ammunition for the artillery. We're going to have to stop that. And it said you're just going to have to figure out on your own. Captain Lee talked with the commander back across the river, and said we're going to try to get out of here, escape here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sharp. Please shell smoke shells around us at that time. So at 3 o'clock we got out and we started running across. A German motorcycle and a soldier came, so he made a quick whip around and went back, and we didn't see him again, but we're right near the edge of the village where this field was, and we started out across there, and that motorcyclist had told the tank what was happening, and so a tank started chasing us across that field. German tank, and he kept firing, and well, for 3 days prior to this, the weather had been so bad that the planes were unable to fly. There were some of the pilots volunteered when they heard we were going to try to get out of there, volunteered to try to get to us, but right in the middle of this field, and I was right in the middle of the field and running and falling and the Germans shooting. Well, here came 4 American planes, and they started bombing and machine gunning the tank. And that allowed us to get over into the woods where they couldn't see us.
Soon after this experience, the war in Europe came to an end. Everett became one of the occupying forces throughout Germany. While stationed in small towns, he continued to help others, in one instance providing medical care for a group of refugees from the Eastern European Baltic states who had been enslaved by Germans and used as labor during the war. They lived in impoverished conditions, unable to return home, and often in need of attention for illnesses, wounds, and malnourishment. Everett helped wherever he could. By August of 1945, Everett finally left Europe for home. His reunion with his family was a happy one, as they had been misinformed that he was missing in action while he was a prisoner of war. For a long time, they had no idea if he was alive or dead. World War II changed Everett's life indelibly.
I probably would never have thought of becoming a doctor, except for my experience in the war of treating the wounded and all that. And then I think I decided I'd take medicine, and then my brother was 12 years younger than I am. When I took medicine, that influenced him to do the same thing, and he's still practicing part-time. He's in California.
Wow.
But I think the whole experience, the fact that I survived it, was good for me. You had a lot of experience and things that you never would otherwise.
Sure. After medical school, Everett settled in Western North Carolina to set up his medical practice. He provided care to anyone and everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. It's impossible to estimate how many lives he saved, how many babies he delivered, how many people he helped. He never planned to be a combat medic in a war, but he took that challenging experience and made something good with it. That's what I admire most about Everett. My friend Everett Smith died on August 27th, 2018, from complications from Alzheimer's disease, which slowly robbed him of his memories in his final years. We recorded his whole story, 6 hours in total, just before his memory began to slip. I once asked him how he had such incredible recall about his time in Europe, and he replied, "Because I never had to kill anyone. There was no reason for me to forget. Long after we recorded his story, we continued to visit with each other. He often asked about the interviews I recorded as the oral history collection grew. Alzheimer's began to rob him of his words toward the end. He couldn't quite figure out how to ask, "So how's it going with that oral history project?" So he improvised. Instead, he asked, "Do you still have courage for what you are doing?" The poetry of it struck me hard, and I wrote his words down. They face me now on a pink sticky note attached to a picture frame on my writing desk, where I see it every single day. Do you still have courage for what you are doing? Well, do you? Do you? Soldier's Heart is written and produced by me, Cindy Briggs, and features veteran stories from North Carolina. We honor vets by listening to their stories. You can follow along on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Soldier's Heart NC. If you have an idea for a story or interview, email us at soldiersheartnc@gmail.com. Special thanks to the New Winston Museum of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where all of these stories are archived. You can learn more about the museum at newwinston.org.